Listen, Callahan, you won't last an hour out here. You're too small, too quiet, too fragile for this battlefield. Kowalski sneered, spitting into the dust as the others chuckled. Certain Erin Callahan was nothing more than dead weight. But hours later, bullets rained down, RPGs split the earth, and even hardened seals were pinned to the ground. In that chaos, Erin did the unthinkable. Bleeding herself, she crawled forward inch by inch, dragging men twice her size through fire and dust where veterans froze. Manuals said to choose who could be saved, but she refused. She would not leave anyone behind. And in those desperate 8 minutes, she redefined courage, turning doubt into a legend whispered in every barracks long after the war. The air at Forward Operating Base Iron Fang was thick with dust and heat, a haze that seemed to hang permanently in the valley. Prefabricated walls leaned against sandbags patched with duct tape, and watchtowers tilted slightly as though the desert itself had grown tired of holding them upright. Soldiers moved in a rhythm that was half exhaustion, half routine, their gear clanking as they crossed the yard. It was into this scene that Erin Callahan stepped down from the supply truck, her aid bag digging into her shoulder. She looked smaller than the others, not in strength, but in presence. Mid-30s, lean from years of field work, her uniform bore stains and frayed seams that spoke of experience, not parade ground polish. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face unreadable as she set her boots firmly on Afghan soil. The SEALs lounging near the armory noticed her immediately. 6 men, their weapons slung casually as though extensions of their bodies, watched her with the half-amused, half-skeptical expressions of veterans who had seen replacements come and go. Petty Officer Kowalski, broad-shouldered and sunburned, spat into the dust and smirked. "Listen, Callahan," he sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. "You won't last an hour out here. Too small, too quiet, too fragile for this battlefield." The others chuckled, not cruelly, but with the kind of laughter that drew a line in the dirt. "You're not one of us." Danner shook his head, adding with a grin, "Maybe the Taliban will line up nice and neat so Doc can hand out Band-Aids." Even young Santos, eager to prove himself, laughed along though his eyes flicked nervously toward her. Erin didn't respond. She let the words hang in the air, then dropped her ruck and opened her aid bag. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, counting combat gauze, checking chest seals, testing tourniquets with a practiced twist. There was no bravado, no fire in her expression, only a calm efficiency that came from years of knowing that when things went wrong, seconds mattered more than pride. Santos leaned on his rifle and asked, almost mocking, "You really think all that's going to help when the shooting starts?" She looked up briefly, eyes cool, not sharp. She noticed more in that single glance than he realized. The salt stains on his uniform from dehydration, Kowalski's weight shifting off his left foot, the frayed radio antenna hanging from Mars, their team leader. Details that could mean the difference between life and death. "When you're choking on your own blood," she said quietly, "it'll help plenty." The words silenced the chuckles. For a moment, the easy arrogance of the group faltered. Santos shifted uncomfortably, then pretended to busy himself with his gear. Erin went back to her kit as if nothing had been said. Mars, the chief petty officer, stood slightly apart from his men, his face shadowed beneath his helmet. He watched her more carefully than the others, noting how her hands never hesitated, how she treated the young SEAL's mockery not with anger, but with focus. He had seen plenty of people bluff readiness. This one wasn't bluffing. Still, the unspoken judgment hung in the air. She didn't belong. This is a reality many have faced. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. In an environment filled with gunfire and orders barked out, a quiet woman like Erin easily becomes a target of doubt and ridicule. But her silence is not fear. It is preparation. That silence allows her to observe, to notice what others miss, and to be ready to do what the loudest voices could never achieve. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The SEALs eventually moved on, talking among themselves, laughter echoing against the concrete walls. Erin remained at the supply truck, her gear squared away, every pouch positioned for muscle memory. She didn't look after them, didn't flinch at their dismissal. If they thought she was weak, that was fine. They would learn the truth soon enough. And in the dust-filled silence of the Afghan base, The first seeds of doubt had already begun to shift, from her shoulders onto theirs. The patrol stepped off at dawn, when the valley was still cool and the shadows stretched long across the jagged terrain. 12 men in staggered column, boots crunching on loose stone, rifles angled toward the ridgelines. The mission on paper was simple: investigate a reported weapons cache in an area the locals called the Broken Teeth, where the cliffs rose in sharp, jagged points against the sky. But Erin Callahan had already learned that simple missions in Afghanistan had a way of becoming complicated. She kept position in the middle of the column, her aid bag riding heavily against her back. She didn't complain about the pace, didn't ask for water breaks, didn't even speak unless necessary. Instead, her eyes moved constantly, scanning not just the horizon for threats, but also the small, human details that others ignored. Kowalski, the loudest critic from the day before, was already draining his canteen too fast. His flushed face and shallow breaths told her he was fighting the first signs of dehydration. Santos, the youngest, was pushing himself too hard in the early kilometers, his breathing ragged, a rookie mistake that could cost him later. Even Mars, the seasoned team leader, carried quiet problems: a frayed antenna on his radio pack, a small but dangerous detail that could mean silence when communication was most critical. Erin noticed it all, but she said nothing yet. The valley floor was unforgiving. Loose gravel shifted under their boots. The air shimmered as the sun rose higher, turning the ground into a stone oven. They passed the debris of older fights, spent shell casings glinting in the sand, blood-dark stains that had long since dried. Every step was heavy with the memory of others who had walked the same ground and never returned. By mid-morning, Kowalski stumbled. It was barely noticeable, just a half step slower, a hand reaching for balance against a boulder. But Erin caught it. She quickened her pace until she was close enough to speak quietly. "Chief," she said to Mars, her tone steady, professional. "We need 5 minutes. Kowalski's showing early heat casualty symptoms, muscle fatigue, mild disorientation. Push him further without intervention, and you'll be carrying him." Kowalski bristled immediately. "I'm fine," he snapped, his pride louder than his voice. But Mars turned to study him more closely. The flush in his cheeks, the glassy look in his eyes, the way his canteen was already nearly empty. Details Mars had missed, but Erin had cataloged at a glance. After a long pause, Mars gave a grim nod. 5 minutes. Hydrate and check gear." They halted in the shade of a rock outcropping. Erin moved efficiently, mixing electrolyte powder with water and handing it to Kowalski. He took it reluctantly, but within minutes his breathing steadied and some of the color returned to his face. Danner, one of the older operators, shook his head in quiet amazement. "How'd you even spot that?" he asked. "He looked fine to me." "Training," Erin replied simply, "and experience." When the team resumed, Kowalski's steps were steadier. He didn't thank her, not out loud, but his silence was acknowledgement enough. The patrol pushed deeper into the valley. The ridgelines rose higher, narrowing their route into a funnel of rock. It was textbook ambush terrain, and every man in the column knew it. The silence grew heavier. Even Santos, usually quick to chatter, kept his eyes fixed on the ridges, one hand tightening on his rifle. Erin's focus never wavered. She marked every shift of weight, every strained breath, every unspoken detail. Where others searched only for the enemy, she searched for the hidden cracks in her own team. To her, the battlefield wasn't just the rocks and the ridgelines. It was the fragile human bodies carrying too much weight into a fight that might demand more than they had to give. Every team has loud voices, the bold, the confident, the ones who command attention. But just as vital are the quiet observers, the ones who watch, who notice the details others miss. Erin Callahan was one of those. Her silence was not weakness, it was vigilance. And often the difference between life and death rests in the eyes of those who see quietly before the danger fully arrives. By the time the sun was high overhead, the patrol was deep inside the Broken Teeth. Radios hissed static, the ridges loomed above, and the men tightened their grips on their weapons. Somewhere ahead, unseen, the real test was waiting. But already in small ways, Erin had begun to shift the balance. She was no longer just dead weight. She was becoming the eyes they didn't know they needed. By noon, the heat had turned the valley into a furnace. The rocks shimmered, The air itself seemed to ripple, and sweat poured beneath the SEAL's body armor. The broken teeth rose higher on either side, jagged cliffs crowding them into a narrow riverbed of broken stone. It was too quiet. Even the insects had gone still. Mars raised his fist, signaling a halt. The men froze, rifles angled toward the ridgelines. His eyes scanned the slopes, searching for the smallest glint of metal or a shadow out of place. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of static from his useless radio. Then the world erupted. The first shot cracked across the valley like a whip, dust spraying at Santos's boots. A second later, an RPG screamed from the ridge, slamming into the opposite bank with a roar that shook the ground. Shards of rock and dirt rained down as the column scattered for cover. Contact! Mars bellowed, diving behind a jagged boulder. Machine gun fire poured down from above, a relentless hammering that pinned the SEALs to the ground. Tracer rounds lit the air in streaks of red and green. Dust and smoke swallowed everything. Erin hit the dirt hard, her aid bag slamming into her ribs. She pressed flat against a slab of broken concrete, the air alive with snapping bullets overhead. Her lungs burned with the acrid stench of smoke and cordite. All around her, chaos. Kowalski screamed as an RPG blast threw him backward, blood pouring from a torn leg. Danner lay gasping, air bubbling through a hole in his chest, a sucking wound. Santos was down too, his arm twisted at an impossible angle, blood soaking into the dust beneath him. 3 men, 3 catastrophic injuries. The textbook said to triage, save the most viable, stabilize if possible, and let go of the rest. Cold logic, clinical, necessary on paper. But Erin Callahan had never been good at following textbooks. She pulled her aid bag closer, unzipping it with hands steady despite the gunfire. The world narrowed to the wounded in front of her. Bullets, explosions, shouts, all of it became background noise. Her focus was absolute. Kowalski first, as she muttered to herself, crawling on her belly toward him. Machine gun rounds chewed the stones inches from her arms, sparks flying. She didn't slow. She hooked her hands under his shoulders, dragging him behind a slab of rock. Blood pulsed from his thigh in bright red arcs. Without hesitation, she ripped a tourniquet free, cinched it high above the wound, and twisted until he screamed. The bleeding stopped. He was still alive. No time for comfort, no time for words. She crawled again, dragging her bag through gravel that tore skin from her elbows. Danner's breast came ragged, frothy with blood. A sucking chest wound. She tore open a packet, slapped a chest seal over the hole, pressing hard until the air stopped bubbling. She taped it down with ruthless precision, then checked his pulse. Weak but there. Gunfire roared around her. Another RPG detonated nearby, the blast hurling grit into her face. She coughed, spat blood from a split lip, and kept moving. Santos was pale, his lips already turning blue. She tore gauze, packed it deep into the wound in his side, wrapping tight to staunch the bleeding. His eyes flicked open, barely conscious. They said you wouldn't last, he whispered, voice hoarse. Neither did I, Erin replied, forcing a grim smile. Guess we were both wrong. For a moment, the firefight faded into the background. Around her, the hardened SEALs, men who had laughed at her just yesterday, watched in stunned disbelief. They were still firing, still returning bursts at the ridges, but their eyes kept darting to the medic who was crawling through hell itself, saving lives 1 inch at a time. Another grenade landed close. The explosion lifted her off the ground, slamming her against Danner's body. Stars burst across her vision. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then she felt blood soaking through her sleeve, her own this time. She forced air into her lungs, grit her teeth, and rolled onto her stomach. She wasn't finished. No one dies here, she muttered, dragging Santos toward the same depression where Kowalski lay. Inch by inch. Every muscle screamed in protest. The ground tore her palms bloody, but she moved, always forward. By the time she reached cover, her uniform was ripped and streaked with red, hers and theirs. She shoved Santos down beside the others, checked their pulses again, forced IVs into trembling veins. Above them, Mars roared into the radio, still getting only static. The fire from the ridges intensified. The enemy knew their prey was wounded and vulnerable. The SEALs braced for a final push. Erin sat in the dirt, her hands slick with blood, staring at three men who by all rights should have been dead already. The manual said it was impossible. She didn't care. She reached for her rifle, propped against the rock. Her hands shook, but her eyes were clear. She wasn't just patching wounds anymore. She was the difference between life and death, the anchor holding the team together when the valley itself tried to tear them apart. For 8 desperate minutes, she became more than a medic. She became the mission. Textbooks reduce war to numbers and calculations. But real battlefields are not cold equations. They are human. Erin refused to decide who lived and who died. In that refusal, she carried the weight of something greater, the belief that every life matters. Sometimes courage is defined not by strategy or orders, but by a stubborn refusal to let go. The ambush raged on, but something had changed. The SEALs no longer saw her as dead weight. They saw her as the one force that stood between them and the grave. And in that valley of fire, Erin Callahan rewrote the definition of strength. Gunfire still shredded the air, a storm of lead and dust tearing across the valley floor. The ridgelines spat fire without pause, the enemy pressing harder, sensing weakness. But Erin Callahan didn't see weakness. She saw 3 lives slipping through her fingers. Her own blood stained her sleeve, dripping down her arm where shrapnel had torn skin. Pain throbbed with every movement, but she ignored it. Her lungs burned, her heart hammered, and yet her focus was absolute. Kowalski lay the farthest out. His bulk sprawled across the gravel, armor cracked and leg torn open beneath the tightened tourniquet. He was easily 60 pounds heavier than her, not counting his gear. Erin dropped flat to her belly and began to crawl toward him, dragging her aid bag behind her like an anchor. Bullets sparked against the stone inches from her head. Shards of rock sliced across her cheek. The valley roared with explosions, tracer rounds carving neon streaks through the dust. Every instinct screamed to stay down, to hide. But Erin moved forward, inch by inch, as if her body belonged to some force greater than fear. She reached him, breath ragged. "I've got you," she whispered, though he was half conscious and barely aware. She hooked her arms under his shoulders, braced her boots against the stone, and began to drag. Every movement felt impossible. Her muscles strained until they shook. Her spine felt like it would split under the weight. Yet slowly, agonizingly, Kowalski's body shifted across the ground. Dust filled her mouth. Her arms burned. But she didn't stop until she pulled him into the shallow depression where the others were huddled. Her chest heaved, her body screamed for rest. But there was no time. Santos was next, clutching his side, bleeding heavily. He tried to wave her off as she reached him. "Leave me," he croaked, his voice breaking. "You won't make it with me." Erin's jaw clenched. "Shut up," she said firmly but not unkindly. "Nobody gets left behind." She slid her hands beneath his vest, ignoring his weak protests. Her boots dug into the gravel, dragging his body inch by inch. Halfway across, a grenade detonated nearby. The blast lifted her off the ground, slamming her back down with Santos's weight crushing her chest. Her ears rang, her vision blurred, but she forced herself to roll, to keep pulling. Her knuckles tore open as she clawed at the dirt. Her knees burned raw. Still she dragged him, inch by inch, every muscle screaming in defiance. At last she reached the depression, rolling him down beside Kowalski, checking his pulse quickly before grabbing for her kit again. 2 down. 1 more to go. Danner was the worst. His chest wound was sealed, but he was fading fast, slipping in and out of consciousness. Erin knew he couldn't move on his own. She staggered toward him, her body heavy with exhaustion, her breath ragged. Bullets tracked her movements, sparks dancing at her heels. She dropped flat again, pulling herself toward him with bloodied hands. She gripped his vest straps and pulled. Nothing. He was heavier than both the others, his gear soaked in blood, weighing him down like an anchor. Erin shut her eyes, swallowed the despair, and pulled again. Her muscles screamed. Her wound throbbed. But slowly, painfully, he shifted. She crawled, dragging him inch by inch, bullets snapping so close she felt their heat against her back. The ground tore her palms raw. Her arms quivered, ready to give out. "Move," she whispered to herself. "Just move." Somewhere behind her, Mars and the other SEALs fired upward, laying suppressive fire. She didn't look back. She just dragged Danner forward, her world reduced to a cycle of pull, gasp, strain, repeat. By the time she reached the others, her body was trembling on the edge of collapse. She rolled Danner into cover, fumbling with her kit to check his wound, forcing herself to stay steady. His chest rose shallowly, but he was alive. She collapsed to her knees, sweat and blood mixing across her face. Around her, 3 men lay breathing, broken, bleeding, but alive. The SEALs who remained uninjured glanced at her between bursts of fire. Their expressions transformed. Just yesterday they had mocked her, sneered at her presence. Now they watched in disbelief as the woman they'd dismissed as too small, too quiet, too fragile, had dragged 3 of their own through a hellstorm and refused to quit. Kowalski, barely conscious, managed a crooked grin. "Still think you won't last, Doc?" Erin leaned back against the rock, chest heaving, eyes hard. "Ask me. When we're all home," she replied. The fight raged on around them, but something inside the team had shifted. The medic they'd written off as dead weight had become their lifeline. There are moments when strength isn't measured in firepower or rank, but in sheer will. Erin Callahan proved that day that determination can drag a man through gunfire when muscle alone cannot. And for the SEALs who watched her, the lesson was seared into memory. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never underestimate the quiet ones who refuse to let go. In that valley, as bullets still rained down, and the clock to survival ticked mercilessly forward, Erin was no longer just a medic. She was the spine of the team, the reason they would live to see another sunrise. The radio spat static, then finally a voice cut through. "Alpha, this is command. QRF inbound. ETA, 8 minutes. 8 minutes. To anyone else it was nothing. But in this valley, under the storm of fire, 8 minutes stretched like a lifetime. The ridges above blazed with muzzle flashes. Tracer rounds seared the air. RPGs cracked the earth apart. The SEALs were pinned, every movement a gamble against death. And in the middle of it all knelt Erin Callahan. Her own blood dripped from her sleeve, where shrapnel had torn deep. Her body screamed with exhaustion, but her mind was locked on one singular purpose: keep them alive. Kowalski lay pale, his tourniquet tight but his pulse fading. Erin slid an IV into his arm with hands that didn't shake, not now. "Fluids in," she muttered, watching his color shift faintly back from death's edge. Danner's chest rose unevenly. The SEAL she had placed bulged dangerously with each breath. She grabbed a needle, plunged it into his chest, and vented the trapped air. The hiss was sickening but necessary. His chest settled. He coughed blood but kept breathing. Sanos whimpered, hand twitching toward his bandaged side. Erin caught his wrist, firm but gentle. "No, don't touch it. Don't. You'll make it worse." She repacked his wound with brutal efficiency, ignoring his cry of pain. Pain meant he was still alive. "Doc!" Mars's voice rang from behind cover as he fired another burst. "How bad?" "Bad," Erin answered flatly, not lifting her head. "But they're still here. They'll stay here if I can hold them together." 7 minutes left. A grenade exploded close, the shockwave blasting grit into her face. She instinctively threw herself over Kowalski's body, shielding him with her own. Her ears rang, blood trickled from her temple, but she rose again and went back to work. Her voice became a lifeline, steady and unyielding. "Kowalski, stay with me. You've carried worse loads. Now let me carry you. Danner, breathe with me. In, out, don't stop. Santos, open your eyes, focus on me. You're not done." Even the uninjured SEALs firing back at the ridges stole glances at her. Yesterday they had mocked her as fragile. Now they were watching her defy death with nothing but grit and bloody hands. 5 minutes left. Her chest burned, her vision blurred, but she refused to falter. Mars shouted for cover fire. Erin snatched her rifle with hands slick with blood, fired a disciplined burst toward the ridge, then dropped it and grabbed her kit again. She was medic and fighter in the same breath. 4 minutes. Kowalski vomited bile. Erin rolled him on his side, cleared his airway, stabilized him, then pivoted back to Danner, whose pulse threatened to slip away. Her hands pressed down with relentless force, pushing life back into his veins. 3 minutes. Her own strength waned, blood seeped from her side, every inhale fire in her lungs. But she didn't slow. She crawled between them, rechecking every bandage, retightening every tourniquet, forcing herself to stay alert. If I stop, they stop, she thought. Not yet. Not one of you dies yet. 2 minutes. The enemy pressed closer. Voices shouted from the ridges. Rifle fire hammered their position. Erin's face was streaked with sweat and dust, but her eyes stayed clear. Every second mattered. Every second was stolen from death. Then, rotors. At first a faint hum, then a rising roar. The sound grew until it filled the valley, the thundering blades of a Blackhawk slicing through the smoke. Relief surged like an electric current. The helicopter banked low, door gunners unleashing suppressive fire that lit up the ridges. Dust and smoke spiraled in its downdraft. The SEALs cheered raggedly. Mars popped smoke, waving the marker. But Erin didn't look up. She was already dragging Kowalski, locking her arms under his vest straps. Her muscles screamed, her vision swam, but she pulled. One dragging step, then another, until the crew chief grabbed him and hauled him aboard. Erin rattled off his condition with clinical speed, then turned back without hesitation. Santos next. His bloodied face twisted in pain as she dragged him through the dust, but she never loosened her grip. He was passed into waiting hands. Then Danner, his chest heaving shallowly. He was the heaviest, his gear soaked with blood. Erin nearly collapsed beneath his weight. Her knees buckled, her breath tore from her lungs. But she braced, pulled, moved him inch by inch until at last the crew hauled him inside. Finally, Erin stumbled aboard. Her body gave out, collapsing to her knees as the helicopter lifted. Wind and smoke filled the cabin. Around her, the 3 men she had refused to give up on lay hooked to fluids, masks pressed over their faces. Alive. For 8 eternal minutes, she had held them between life and death. And she had won. 8 minutes. In normal life, it passes in the blink of an eye. But under fire, it is an endless test of endurance. Every heartbeat fought for, every breath wrestled back from death. Erin Callahan proved that courage isn't just about firing rounds or charging ridges. It's about the will to keep someone alive when the clock and the battlefield both say you can't. That is the power of unyielding focus. That is what carried them through the valley. The official after-action report was 3 pages long. Typed in sterile language, it listed coordinates, unit strength, casualties sustained, and medical interventions. It noted an ambush in a narrow valley, suppression fire from the ridgelines, and the eventual extraction of 3 critically wounded operators. Erin Callahan's name appeared only once, tucked into a sentence. Unit medic provided stabilization under hostile conditions. That was all. On paper, it was forgettable. A record among thousands, destined to vanish into archives where no one would ever read it again. But outside the paperwork, in the dim corners of barracks and around burned barrels at night, her story refused to die. Soldiers don't remember reports. They remember the moments when everything went wrong and someone refused to let go. The SEALs who had been there told it first. At the chow hall, with trays balanced on their laps, they'd shake their heads and say, "You should have seen Callahan. Bullets everywhere, and she just kept dragging us through the fire." Their voices carried a mixture of disbelief and reverence, like men still trying to understand how they had walked away alive. Soon the story spread. New replacements arriving at the base heard it on their first night. Young soldiers with too much swagger would boast about how they'd handle combat, and the veterans would cut them off with a quiet correction. You don't know courage until you've seen Erin Callahan keep 3 men breathing when no one thought they'd make it. In those retellings, she became more than a medic. She became a symbol. Proof that courage didn't always wear rank or muscle, didn't always carry the biggest gun. Sometimes it came in the form of a woman who worked in silence, who carried more weight than her body should have allowed, who refused the easy choice of letting someone die. Kowalski, when he recovered, never joked about dead weight again. In fact, he was the one who told her story loudest. He would roll up his pant leg, show the scar above his knee, and say, "See that? She saved it. Saved me too." The laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was the kind that comes from awe. For Santos, who nearly bled out in that riverbed, her name carried a different weight. He called her the reason I still get to see the sunrise. Danner, with his chest scar running like a second mouth across his ribs, never spoke much about it. But when people mentioned Erin, he would nod quietly, eyes distant, and that silence said enough. Years later, long after deployments ended, the legend lingered. Around kitchen tables back home, around reunions where old soldiers swapped memories, her name surfaced again and again. Erin Callahan, the medic who redefined what it meant to be strong. And that was how legends are born. Not in the official records, but in the whispers, the retellings, the reverent pauses of those who lived because of her. Because in the end, courage isn't measured by the size of your weapon. It's measured by the refusal to let your people die. Erin Callahan had carried that truth through dust and fire. And long after the war, long after the reports had faded, the story of that day still lived. In every barracks, every campfire, every soldier's memory of the medic who became their shield. Courage doesn't always roar from the front lines. Sometimes it whispers in quiet determination, like Erin Callahan crawling through fire, refusing to abandon her brothers when every textbook said it was impossible. Her story reminds us of something deeply American, that true strength isn't about size, noise, or pride. It's about resilience. It's about the grit to hold on when everyone else says let go. In today's world, we may not face bullets or ambushes in a valley, but we all face our own battles. Loneliness, health struggles, financial hardships, family conflicts. And just like Erin, sometimes the victory comes from refusing to quit, from noticing the small details others ignore, from being the steady, silent presence that keeps people around us going. Her 8 minutes of survival can be our 8 minutes of patience with a loved one. Her dragging 3 men to safety can be our choice to carry a friend through hard times. And her refusal to leave anyone behind reminds us that in our communities, in our families, we can choose the same. But here's the question I leave with you. Would you have the courage to crawl forward when the world tells you to stop? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Share how Erin's story connects to your own life or what courage means to you. Thank you for listening. If you believe these stories matter, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help us keep these voices alive.